Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we have Dr. Cindy and Dr. Pamela Walsh from Athabasca University, who will speak to us about organizational change experienced by universities adopting online learning, partnerships for success. Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Cindy Ives, and my research partner, Pamela Walsh, you want to wave, Pam? Is here with me. We welcome this opportunity to share the results of our recent research with the CNIE audience. We are former vice presidents and current faculty members in the graduate distance education programs at Athabasca University, a Master of Education and a Doctorate in Education. And we are joining you from our homes in Alberta. We are presenting here one aspect of the findings of our research on organizational change experienced by universities adopting online learning. Today, we focus on themes related to partnerships, success, educational development, instructional design. Before getting started, we want to acknowledge Athabasca University grant funding in support of this presentation, as well as our research assistant, Catherine Johnson, who is a doctoral student at Athabasca University. And so Pam is going to get us started.
Thank you, Cindy, and good morning, everyone. So this slide provides an overview of our presentation today. And in case you don't recognize the image, it is a graph. The motivation for our pre-COVID study was the significant global growth of online learning and our experience as distance educators. We were interested in the disruptive and transformational potential of online learning and understanding more about the why and how during the 2002 to 2017 transition to online learning over a 15-year period. We selected participants who were directly involved in the move. We sought diverse perspectives by including deans, directors, educational developers, instructional designers, provosts, and vice presidents. We include the voices of these individuals throughout our presentation. So on this next slide, we have our research questions, which are related to drivers of change, roles of leaders and leadership, and participant recommendations. In our presentation this morning, we offer selected findings with additional findings available in our article published this month in the Canadian Journal for Higher Education. We provide a link to the article at the end of the slides and in our handout. So moving along, where we have a map of Canada, more about our qualitative exploratory methodology. While we found many studies about the move to online learning in other countries, in our review of the literature, we found very few focused on Canadian universities. We received research ethics approval from all 7 participating universities, thereby committing ourselves to confidentiality of interviewees and their universities. During the 2019 and 2020, we interviewed individuals in universities across Canada, from the Atlantic provinces to British Columbia. A commonality, all participating universities were members of the Canadian Virtual University and shared a common commitment to online learning. We can tell you that universities in our study included those that are traditional place-based institution and those with a mandate for open and online learning. All of these universities made substantial progress towards transitioning from face-to-face or correspondence education to some level of online delivery between 2002 and 2017. So we learned that there were many disruptions to traditional structures and practices during the transition, and that the drivers of change included access to education for a wider variety of individuals, opportunities for revenue generation for the universities and advances in technology. We heard that online learning and teaching methodologies challenged traditional cultures and practices. Our participants shared that an enhanced focus on designing courses for effective online learning was resulting in improvements to the quality of classroom teaching. Our participants shared their lessons learned and recommendations. They told us stories about what happened. They were honest and frank, sometimes emotional. They shared lessons learned and their recommendations for other universities thinking about moving online, including the need for vision, collaboration, and distributed leadership. Our interviewees also stressed the need for strategic investment in the educational development, both pedagogical and technological, of instructors and professional staff. The quotes that we are going to share with you today focus on communication, consultation, and expertise, as well as the need for dedicated resources, because these are some of the key themes and critical actions for success, which led to their and our conclusion about the importance of partnerships. So this slide represents the centrality of strategic partnerships and the importance of relationships and working together toward shared goals and success. The involvement of learning designers and educational developers in partnership with faculty is now being recognized as critical to success in the online world. Leadership exists in recognizing and supporting the expertise of these groups and enabling them to work in partnership. We have evidence to believe there are multiple opportunities for instructional designers and faculty developers to influence change, institutional priorities, and decision-making about the future. On this slide, we have a quote on collaboration from one of our participants. It highlights the importance of sharing ideas in order to think creatively about how to teach online and how to understand it better. Another participant, not represented here on the slide, talked about collaborative strategies, such as workshops that draw in campus faculty with instructional designers and educational developers, and how these activities support teaching and learning across the institution. Cindy.
This next slide offers a quote from a participant that emphasizes the need for effective leadership that understands the implications of online technologies for enhancing teaching and learning experiences and practices. The scholarship of learning in an academic environment is important to faculty and to their supports. Other aspects of leadership were also highlighted. For example, a participant said, a common vision of what online learning is for institutions is very, very important. Lesson number one is that it will go a whole lot easier when there is that championship at the top, very senior championship. Multiple participants indicated that championship from senior leaders was expected, as was a clear articulation of the reasons for moving online. This next theme is around relationships. Some participants spoke about the challenges and opportunities of building relationships and working with faculty productively. Fear, a major stumbling block, and dealing with fear. For example, you can't work the same way with every faculty member that walks in the door or the virtual door. You have to meet the faculty where they are, and I think that's what we're trying to give people in need. The experience helps you deal. And here, another quote, you need to have those relationships and you need to build on those relationships so you can move things forward. because you need to have those little successes to show that what you're doing actually does make sense and actually is successful and actually does work. In order to make all this happen, resources are necessary. The need for appropriate and adequate resources was stressed as critical. This quote may resonate with some of you. Another quote that supports this is when distance education is being introduced into the institution, or any initiative for that matter, unless people understand it and believe in it and are willing to put resources towards it, it's going to be a very tough slog. It is clear that the shortage of resources and professional development opportunities contributed to resistance and other challenges in the participating universities. Aligned with resources is the support that the resources cover. The need for adequate support is linked. Transformation of teaching through online learning was a goal for many of our participants. Another interviewee proposed a solution to the difficulties faced in one university, a centralized support group that's competent to support faculty, to assist with program development, to come alongside faculty in putting courses online, and actually to be able to fund online course development. I think that's a key piece. One of the organizational structure changes was described as an appropriate version of support in one university. Some universities centralized their services, others decentralized. The conclusion is that support services must be designed to meet the specific university needs. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So for example, this quote, we started to put instructional designers in faculties that had a lot of online courses. So they were our staff, but they would spend some time being in the faculty as a resource to that faculty, a kind of matrix structure in that institution. So our conclusion and their conclusion, instructional designers and educational developers can be influential. At the end of all of this is our perspective, but it's not just ours. It was the perspective of our participants as well. They talked about the marginalized voices of instructional designers and educational developers that have been unheard or unheeded in many cases, at least until recently, remembering again that this is a pre-COVID study. Collaborative leadership points to the involvement of those with expertise in online learning design in the plans for and implementation of online learning. This brings us back to the notion that we started with at the beginning about partnerships for success. We want to thank you for your participation today. We have a handout of references available. We invite you to review them. We share the link here to the article that describes the study in detail that is published this month in the Canadian Journal of Education. And we are open to questions and discussion, especially since we thought we had 20 minutes and it turns out we have an hour. So we are wide open and looking forward to conversation. I'm going to stop sharing the slides and we can have a conversation.
I'll invite everyone to use chat. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen, or you can always come on with your microphone.
No question. I see a whole bunch of things in chat here.
I don't think there's a question in chat.
I don't see one.
No.
Yes, thanks, Saul. Our slides actually are also available in the conference platform. So Saul's saying two thoughts: contract workers.
Yeah.
A lot of our participants complained about having had to use contract online learning specialists in the move to online. The resources were not provided. This was given as evidence of lack of support, lack of leadership, and lack of understanding of the importance of partnerships. So yes, the people we spoke to were not contract workers,
Yeah.
but they were in positions that made the fact that they had to work with contract workers awkward for them.
And that's talking to at least one, if not a couple of participants about this. They were very emotional about when reflecting on that time during the transition and how hard they had to work with so few resources. Somebody's talked about centralization versus, I guess, decentralization, noting that centralization organizes skills together but loses connection to the content. Maybe Cindy, you have a comment on that.
Well, it's interesting, Saul. I'm reading your point here about how lessons from the corporate sector might be helpful. Yes and no, I want to say. There are so many risks associated with applying the lessons learned from the corporate sector into an academic environment that articulating it in that way might not be helpful. On the other hand, this pendulum swing that I think you're talking about happens in universities as well. I've worked in universities for almost 40 years. The centralization, decentralization, top-down leadership, bottom-up leadership, these things swing in, I think, after it happens in the corporate sector, but it's awkward to be using corporate language. At the same time, there are efficiencies and strengths of applying models from other places without applying them in a kind of top-down way. So for example, I said, not one size doesn't fit all. It's really important that the people who are part of it's a little like appreciative inquiry. The people who are part of a change need to be involved in deciding how that change is going to be designed and implemented.
If I can just say something,
Yep.
it's not, I know that there's like beyond outrageous sensitivity to the corporate environment in higher ed. The real issue is that they have an experience that is informative of how this should be. And so I think it's important not to dismiss the source, the information or the experience just because there may be questions about the source. Because I think, and that's really the point here, it's that they've experienced the centralization and decentralization. And really what the core of the issue is, and it's coming out in some other literature, is that people in our field need both process expertise in designing and developing courses, and unfortunately, they also need a certain level of subject matter expertise, as much as we like to de-emphasize that. And the problem is that you can't be excellent at everything. And so what happens is, and this is the same problem they have in corporations. And it's interesting because I've looked at perceptions of trainers and I've looked at perceptions of tech writers. All of them have the same basic problem. And one of the issues is that a lot of the literature that's been done on instructional designers has only talked to the instructional designers and it doesn't talk to the other party. And so what happens is that you end up with the Fox News bubble, but it's with instructional designers talking about what we would like rather than looking at that holistic thing. We definitely do need to talk to the other partners, but we also need to, I mean, you're looking at a particular audience, but I think when we look a little bit more broadly, we really need to include the faculty in our research, and they seem to be an absent party in a lot of it.
Okay, so that's fair. That's absolutely fair. The faculty, we did not study faculty, but we did study senior leadership. And the senior leadership had some of the same things to say as the instructional designers and the educational developers. Extremely important point.
But you know what? Your senior leaders are also usually left out. So that's really good. So I'm not trying to criticize you for that.
No, I think what we're seeing is marginalized voices in a variety of different ways. And we haven't talked to students. That was not the nature of our work. We are looking at organizational change, but student voices are often also left out. I want to go back
to Marty.
To Marty, yeah.
Yes, Marty.
Do you want to deal with that?
Yeah, Marty, Marty was going to, I think, speak to this. Go ahead, Marty.
Well, I want to say something quick about what Saul is saying, because I have worked in the corporate world. I had an instructional design agency that served an international group that developed courses for the corporate world. The value set and the ways in which people perceive the reason we're doing what we're doing is so entirely different that it becomes problematic. But I think Saul does have a point, because here's one of my working theories. And maybe before, I'm getting kind of old here, but I would like to take another look at this. One of the challenges I see is that universities have a significant number of PhDs. PhDs are great, or advanced study is great. However, it requires a certain amount of isolation and thinking on your own and so on. So then you have to take the skills that those people have around you, the social skills, the ability to collaborate and understand power and how it's shared, I think is problematic. So one of the things, I talked about yesterday was this whole issue of faculty role. And I'm an advocate because I get to work with instructional designers and web analysts and people who support my courses, even though I know how to do it and could do it myself. I can't possibly get my research and writing done and look at every single piece of possibility to create in my courses. So we absolutely need to collaborate. I love that you use that word. And I think we also need some leadership development, because I have experienced absolutely outstanding leadership in my work as an academic. And I have experienced some of the worst leadership that, and because I teach leadership, I can give you a taxonomy. Anyway, it's I don't want to be unkind though. Those people who were not skilled, I'll say, in carrying out their leadership duties were not, incompetent people by any stretch. They just didn't know. They didn't know what it takes to motivate people to get high levels of performance, to be inclusive, to juggle it all, and give up perhaps some of your power and authority in order to share it and not have to do anything. So I'd love to hear, we're going to run out of time here, but I'd love to hear from you on what you heard from people about the possibility of leadership development. Can we get the message out there that everything is changing? The way we lead has to change as well.
So thank you for that, Marty. When we're talking about leadership in this study, we're talking about leadership and leaders. Leaders, the executive leadership is obviously one layer of leadership, and then there's a leadership that exists or emerges within faculty and instructional designers and others. Back during the time of this transition, a lot of our participants reflected when we spoke to them about leadership not providing, the executive leadership not providing the guidance, the oversight, not inspiring the academy and others with the goal and a vision and goals for the future. They were, I think, and Cindy, I would like Cindy to speak to this as well. They were not that interested in some cases in what was going on. They supported it at some level, but it was in some cases, and not all cases, it was bringing in revenue, and that was important. So Cindy, did you want to add to that, please?
Well, I don't disagree. I agree with what Marty said. I agree with what you've said. I agree with what Saul said. This is a very complex set of issues. Mm-hmm. The revenue generation piece of the first wave, if I can call it that, of moving online, whether it was from traditional or from a distance mm-hmm. background, appears to me to have sort of compromised the planning and the understanding around what the potential of online learning was for transformation of teaching. There's a lot of lingo, a lot of promotion and marketing around, internal marketing around the value of online learning for expanding the power of the institution in one way or another. But there wasn't the resources, the understanding of what that all meant. There's sort of an assumption that, and we see it all the time, an assumption you can take a face-to-face course, turn it online overnight, and it's called an effective online learning course. And COVID showed us this as well. But we, those of us who know about online learning are clear that remote teaching is not the same thing. So that's one thing I want to say. The thing I want to say about leadership, though, is that leadership exists at all levels of the organization. Mm-hmm. Top-down leadership has its challenges. Bottom-up leadership tends not to get things done. Some kind of middle-out strategy that involves both top and bottom, hierarchically in a university, that's an awkward kind of thing to talk about, but where everybody exercises leadership. And so maybe leadership development, Marty, to partly answer your question, needs to happen at all levels. Every single individual, instructional designer, educational developer, faculty member, institutional leader of, in a formal sense, everybody needs to exercise their own leadership to be working together to work towards a kind of common goal. The top-down piece is the articulation of what that common goal is. And then it's everybody's responsibility in the organization to interpret that in a way that makes sense for them. Now, before I go, well, let me just pick up what Deborah's saying about the connection with fear. Mm-hmm. Because I think fear gets in the way of changing practice. Fear gets in the way of adopting a sense of personal responsibility for things like leadership and change. And fear gets in the way of good personal, interpersonal relationships. So how to deal with fear? I don't know. Appreciative inquiry just popped out of my mouth. I think that is one way it's beginning to be shown in higher education, that appreciative inquiry initiatives work in our own university. It's been used very successfully in our own faculty, in fact, for managing change. And so there are some techniques and approaches that deal with individual fear. I think the other piece is that communication collaboration also help to dissipate the fear. You do need to build trust, but you need to talk to each other. And whether you're talking in this sort of format or face-to-face, you still need to get to a place where you've got a common understanding. I don't know if that helps, Pam.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. I want to move on to another question about suggestions on how institutions can be more inclusive in their decision-making, where to start and how to start. We mentioned distributed leadership in our presentation. We think that distributed leadership, although it has its issues from a conceptual perspective, it's important to note that in a university, and those of us, all of us who are in universities would know this, that universities are very complex organizations. Some would say that presidents get very little opportunity to actually make significant changes. The distributed leadership allows people through conversation, for example, and shared experiences to come up with ideas about what can work and how it can work. So I think that it's important, I think, for top-down leadership to enable those kinds of conversations. Conversations between instructional designers and faculty members, for example, in our study, were empowering. And then instructors talking to instructors once they had tried online learning, where others were more resistant. Once they had incorporated online learning into their practice, they talked about it with others, with other instructors. And interest and fear. I think fear was probably overcome to some extent through those kinds of conversations. So how do you provide a safe and inclusive space for voices to be heard? I think you have to enable leadership in your organization. Cindy, would you like to add to that?
Well, we haven't talked about this. Pam and I haven't talked about this in particular, but it occurs to me, one of the things we've seen in recent years is the creation of associate vice presidents for teaching and learning. What we're seeing across the Canadian higher education landscape, this includes colleges as well, and it may be in other countries, but we haven't studied that. This position is almost inevitably filled by someone who has an educational development background. Many educational developers have instructional design backgrounds. The leadership role, in a way, is a formal recognition of and an articulation, I guess, of a priority for a focus on teaching and learning. And so this may be one way that organizations are moving forward. Now, maybe there's somebody in this meeting who occupies one of those associate VP or associate provost or deputy provost positions that are beginning to appear. To me, I think these are quite powerful. We are also seeing cases where educational developers and people with that background are moving into other leadership roles, formal leadership roles within universities. So presidents and vice presidents, academic as well. So I'm not answering Afsani's question about a safe space, but I am saying that we're beginning to see the recognition of a need for leadership, and then the construction of roles and units, I suppose, that offer leadership. And maybe that is one strategy in some contexts, and that might not work in all contexts. Creating safe spaces is about creating trust and building respect. And in that notion, I see Stephen's question about whether faculty are going to be willing to accept others in the universities as equals. I actually think that's really critical, that we can find ways. This just comes out of my 40 years in higher education. We need to find ways where people are respected for their expertise, for their skills, for their openness and willingness to communicate, and not dismissed because of the square box that they fill on the org chart. My soapbox. Time for me to get off, Pam.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at the chat box, and I think we had a comment from David about getting messaging from corporate partners who are targeting instructors and bypassing instructional designers altogether. I guess that's not surprising, but if David, would you like to speak to that? You're not obligated to, but thank you.
That's okay. Actually, that's kind of less important than the discussion that's happening a little further down the chat, but it's something that we're seeing from some of the more predatory companies out there, but also from some of our regular partners that assume that it's our instructors who are doing all the work of putting courses online. And so in a way, our expertise is being ignored on every side.
So David, I'm sorry, Pam, go ahead.
Go ahead.
What I think we're seeing is a growing recognition that instructional designers, for example, are indeed experts. And this, I think the whole remote learning, pivoting and all of that stuff has raised the level of awareness of the leadership of education developers and instructional designers. So I think that respect is growing. Cindy, would you agree with that?
I think so. One of the things that I heard yesterday was that the number of jobs for instructional designers and educational developers is increasing and has increased in the last year. And unfortunately, I think many of these are contract jobs, which is difficult. But the more online teachers, if I can put it this way, are aware that they need and can benefit from, and that that student learning is stronger if instructional designers, web developers, if there's a team supporting the instruction, the more you build those relationships and those networks. And it really is a network kind of communication. It's not, it's kind of starts one-on-one, but then expands from there. And so I think we have an understanding of instructional designers. I, as an ID, work with one faculty member. That faculty member shares what he or she has learned with other faculty members who share that with the instructional designers that they work with. And so we build these nice networks, which are both communication networks, they're expertise sharing networks, they're communities of practice. I mean, even at Athabasca, we have a community of practice called the Community of Learning Design, which involves some faculty as well as learning designers and some media specialists and so on. These groups don't have any power in the formal sense, and I think that's some of what our study showed. But I think that over time, they're going to have influence. They do have influence now, and once the influence is actually recognized, then they will have more power. So I don't know how that gets to kind of David's conversation around these corporations coming in at the faculty level. That's a traditional model. And it's a business model, right? It's like the early online providers were looking at the revenue generation potential rather than at the kind of, if I can say, learning generation potential or learning support potential of online learning.
Stephen has made an interesting comment. Academics and academic leaders haven't had the time and or inclination to look beyond traditional courses, but online learning demands something different. I think that's really true. And I don't know if Stephen would like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, as you all know, I've been working in this field for a long time, but not in a faculty role, which has given me the time to think about different approaches to online learning. And my experience is that, and we've seen this with the COVID response and remote learning, the typical response of academics is to want to put a course online. And that's fair enough, and I don't blame them for that. There's all kinds of reasons for that, and I get that. But people, and this ties into learning the lessons from the corporate sector, and it's not so much about learning the lessons from the corporate sector per se. It's about learning the lessons from people who've spent a lot of time focused specifically on what works, and I hate that phrase, but what works in online learning, effective approaches to online learning, because the field is very different. The relation between instructors and students is different. The power dynamics are different. The ways of communicating are different. And it can often be really hard to get a handle on. And one of the ways that it's different is that the standard academic unit of the course is often less effective. And again, I don't like that phrase, and I'm eliding a bunch of points there, but is often less effective as a vehicle for online learning than alternative strategies. And never mind what those strategies are, there are alternative strategies. And so there needs to be a way to bring in those alternative strategies into the online learning environment at universities. And the fundamental question that this panel raises really is how, because those who are both nominally and explicitly in charge are those who are also the people who haven't really had the opportunity or the inclination to think much beyond traditional online courses. Now, Athabasca University is an exception to this, a partial exception, because it's still set up in a traditional academic structure. But nonetheless, it spent 40, 50, whatever years focusing on how to do learning online and learning at a distance well. But if we think about the rest of institutions where online learning really was, as was mentioned earlier, just a way to make some quick money to hopefully fund the traditional activities of academics, that didn't happen. And so the question here is, how do you get that alternative view into the system? And I don't see how, honestly. I don't see how you do it. I don't see how you do it without changing the power dynamics, because the people who have the power at a university aren't going to make that decision, aren't going to go in that direction. They're going to keep going in a traditional way until they're forced, kicking and screaming, to do something different. And again, with COVID, we've seen the pushback and the response of academics. And again, I don't blame them. This is not a blame thing. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying it's not surprising, given the fact that most of them, virtually all academics, are actually experts in other things,
Right.
which is what we want.
Do you think you've already kind of answered this question, but do you think that the experience of remote learning will have changed some minds? We can read the commentary from experts and non-experts about this will be perhaps a transformational time in our history. What do you think?
Well, I made a prediction on Twitter yesterday, which turned out to be far more popular than the session I did yesterday. And the prediction was that after the pandemic, academics and their institutions will rush as rapidly as possible back to normal, the normal that existed before the pandemic, and get back to traditional teaching the traditional way. But society at large won't. People have discovered a lot of stuff does work better online.
Right.
But academics didn't make that same discovery, again, because they didn't have the time, the resources, the inclination, and in some cases, the power to do that.
Thank you for that. Cindy, do you have anything you would like to ask or add?
Afsani's asking if she could share some thoughts about how we can start. And I think that's brilliant, because as I was looking over my notes this morning, I'm thinking, what's going to happen next? If we have time for a question, somebody's going to say, how do we do this? How do we build those partnerships? I'm hoping that Afsani, as a leader in this field, maybe has something to share with us. So go for it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful session. I love it. And I always like listening to Stefan. He always has great ideas. I can say from a marginalized perspective person, a people of color in a research university such as UBC, I think that we shouldn't wait for the right time or who is going to do it. It starts from us. Like, we should see that, how do I include someone else in my practice? How do I involve them in my simplest task? How do I acknowledge their work? How do I include them in my study? When I do my study, should I contact the vice president or actually instructional designer groups? This is how we can give them a ladder, a voice. And I think that I believe it actually starts with us, not the leadership, because leadership have been there for such a long time. They are not going to give us a space unless we ask for it. And this is us to do it, to be a role model, to be able to acknowledge our own biases, to acknowledge our own attachment to the power, to be open to the new ideas, to be open to disruptive approaches, which is going to bring us a better result, more inclusive, and a more, or a better word for educational system. So what I'm trying to say is that if each one of us start from our own practices to see that how we can be more inclusive, how we can acknowledge our own biases, how we can take different ways to model that is important to be giving a safe environment for everyone, such as this session, to share their ideas. That's where we can start. That's how we can start the wave and how we can, make the changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Afsani. That's brilliant. And I knew you would have something to offer us, having just listened to your podcast. I think this is around the notion that leadership exists at all levels as well.
Mm-hmm.
We are all leaders, and how we identify ourselves and build our own capacity is kind of important. So this isn't just about changing organizations. This is about changing ourselves. And you can't force change on people. People have to, and this is partly what our participants said as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can't force change. You need to encourage, support, resource, and lead change, vision change, and you need to do it together, whether it's in an academic institution or some other kind of non-corporate environment. In a corporation, you can force change, but it doesn't work very well and it hurts people. So I guess that brings me back to the appreciative inquiry approach,
Mm-hmm.
where you acknowledge and respect the perspectives of others, the expertise of others, and you start with that before going on.
We heard from our participants in traditional universities who offer distance education, online learning, that in fact the move to online learning had an impact on traditional face-to-face courses. I'm not suggesting that was a huge finding on our part, but what it is a finding that those faculty members who saw what others were doing, and while they may not want to move online fully, interested in it, in integrating technology in their classroom. And I think that we may see that potentially after this pivot remote to remote learning, that while maybe faculty won't buy into fully online learning, they may be willing to, or maybe more interested in integrating technology into their pedagogy. Deborah Dell said some time back, she didn't ask a question, I don't believe, Deborah, but she did talk about the importance, or agree with the importance, of appreciative inquiry, and spoke to the fear of where that fear comes from, and with faculty members and others who, in terms of moving online. And certainly I think, Cindy, you've addressed that. It's the fear of the unknown, which leads to that resistance to change.
And Saul's brought us back to a reminder that change is difficult everywhere.
Yes.
Change is difficult in all environments, even personal environments. And I don't really want to end us on we're starting to run out of time. I don't want to end us on the sort of downer of how hard change is. The people we talked to were responsible for or involved in significant change in their environments. And some of them were hurting as a result of it. Now we're hearing from people how much they're hurting as a result of COVID imposed change. So we do need strategies on both personal and organizational levels that help us deal with these kinds of threats to our sense of selves. And I don't know, but that the enhancement of our capacity or our skill building isn't one way of dealing with change and dealing with our individual fear as well.
We've had several others make comments, Molly, O'Neill, and Kelly, and Helena, and May. And maybe we should ask if anybody would like to speak to the comments that they've made.
While people are thinking about that, in terms of resources on leadership that we would recommend,
yes,
I think there are some resources in our handout, Carol, but I think I would also refer you to Marty's resources and her work in leadership. I saw some, Marty, in your presentation, I saw some references that I wasn't familiar with. So I don't know if you've got a handout from your session or if you could put a handout into your session, because I think there's some useful resources in there as well.
Thanks, Cindy. The resources are actually listed on 3 different slides, and I did curate them. They're very carefully selected. So, and I did load the slides up, but let me know if you want me to send it to you personally.
Well, I'd love it, because Carol is on the board of the CNIE, and I think maybe the CNIE board would love to talk about this some more. We have our annual general meeting, as you know, coming up, but as we move into our next year of activity. So if you could send it to me, that'd be great. And you've uploaded your slides so people can see some of those resources as well. That's fantastic.
I think we've included in our handout readings on distributed leadership.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think that distributed leadership was popular at one point and then sort of disappeared a little bit. But distributed leadership is already what's occurring in universities because you have a siloed groups in an organization, and within those groups, people are exercising their leadership. And so providing an enabling environment for people to exercise their leadership across the university is, I think, very important for the executive leadership to understand.
And let me just add to that, the distinction between formal and informal leadership we have not made today, but formal leaders also fear. They also are uncomfortable sometimes with change and don't have the skills, as I think Stephen has pointed out. Informal leaders can help the formal leaders. Informal leadership needs to be seen and accepted. Informal leadership is often exercised by people who have been marginalized in past structures. And I think as we see more and more opening up and more diversity and more inclusion, we may begin to see new models of informal leaders informing, there's too many forms in here, informal leaders informing formal leaders in order to broaden that to something that's more collaborative and more productive. Not just maybe in universities, but in any organization or context. So partnerships for success. I think we've talked about some of those things. Pam and I appreciate all your positive comments. I'm glad that you've been so active in the conversation. And we look forward to ongoing discussions of this sort. If you're interested, you've got our emails, and we hope you let us know what you think of the larger article as well, if you get a chance to read it down the road. And I think we're pretty close to the top of the hour. And so maybe we should, Pam, last words, and then we'll hand it back to Barbara to shut us down.
No, just very quickly, such a great participation from the group, and we really do appreciate that. Some really great questions, some things stimulate some thought, and again, we hope you get a chance to at least scan our article. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you so much, Cindy and Pamela, for opening the box to a very hopeful, I'm quoting someone from chat, conversation. I encourage everyone also to go back to our session schedule. We have a few more delicious ones coming up for the day. Thank you again. I will stop the recording and see you all soon virtually. Thank you.